Hey guys, so this should be my final video on the solar equipment as I don't plan on doing any future upgrades beyond this point, but also because I don't want my channel to become known as the solar guy. But I had a number of loose ends I wanted to tie up, so let's dig in. I'm going to start by telling you a little story. A few months ago, I was working along on some code in my backyard studio building late in the evening. And at some point, my wife comes into the building and tells me that the washing machine and dryer had quit working and asked me to come have a look at it. When I go to the laundry room, I noticed that the machines were just dead. There didn't appear to be any power to them at all. And I thought that was odd, so I wanted to go check the breakers in the garage. But when I walked past my EV charger, something odd caught my eye. I'd had this charger since 2011 and it has always had at least 2 indicator lights lit up at all times. But this particular day, it was just totally dark. So I sat there confused for a moment, wondering what the heck was going on. And when I opened the breaker box, I found nothing tripped there or on the EcoFlow smart panel. So I hit the garage door button to open the garage, and when I looked outside, that's when I realized what was going on. The grid was down. The rest of the neighborhood was completely dark, except for a couple of my neighbors walking down the street with a flashlight. And when they saw my garage open and my lights on inside, they walked up to me and said, "Hey David, how come it is that your house has power and nobody else does?" My backyard studio building runs pretty much off-grid most of the time, especially when the weather isn't extreme. And my house has its own system as well, and the way it's wired up, it powers almost everything in the house. In fact, it would be easier for me to tell you the things that it does not power, which is the washer and dryer, oven, microwave, our primary car charger, the dishwasher, and the central air conditioner. Basically, everything else in the house runs off-grid most of the time. But now you can see why the washer and dryer quit working, as well as my EV charger. So while I've performed a number of these planned tests, this was the first time we'd seen a real power outage since installing all of this equipment. It only lasted about 2.5 hours. I think a transformer down the road had caught on fire. But the interesting thing is, it was only like 80 degrees outside, and honestly, if my wife had not been doing laundry at the time, it is very possible we could have gone the entire 2.5 hours without ever noticing that the power was out. And while the tests I've done in the past are always worst case scenario tests, which sometimes didn't go as planned, this unplanned test was a breeze. So a lot of people have asked me why I use this EcoFlow stuff and I don't just go with a regular grid-tied residential system. And for that, I want to tell you another story. This footage is in the direct aftermath of Hurricane Beryl after it blew through this Houston neighborhood. Trees were down everywhere, and most of the area was without grid power. Now, this is my friend Johnny Himberger's house, and he had a standard grid-tied solar system on his roof, as you can see here. Unfortunately, even after the sun came out, these panels were completely useless, because like most of these systems, when the grid is down, they shut down too. Johnny was without grid power for an entire week while the temperature was over 100 degrees with high humidity, a dangerous combination. The only source of power he had were these 4 DIY panels that he had mounted to his fence and a small generator. And between these two, he was able to keep a window unit air conditioner running in one room of the house. So I've always tried to be clear that with my setup, emergency preparedness is the #1 goal, and any electrical savings I get above and beyond that is considered a bonus. I've also got another gripe with grid-tied solar that I've never heard anyone else mention. But growth of this sector is unsustainable, and here's why. Imagine this cozy neighborhood is a representation of every house in the country. Everyone is connected to the power grid, and everyone has an electricity bill. Now, one guy decides to install solar, and this of course eliminates his electricity bill completely. And this works because during the day he's pumping extra power into the grid, and then when night comes, he pulls power back from the grid to make up the difference. In a sense, he's using the grid as a battery. Now, what happens when everyone else decides this is a great idea, and they install solar too, and then they eliminate their electricity bills too? Now, the trouble is, they're still using the grid for nighttime power, but who's paying for the grid at this point? The answer is nobody. And thus, that's why I say this type of setup is unsustainable long term. So the other problem I have with grid-tied solar is not so much a problem with the technology itself, but rather the companies selling it to you. I consider the vast majority of the solar companies, especially the ones that come knocking on your door with the high-pressure sales pitch, I consider them to be scammers. Now, when I say scammers, I don't mean along the lines of like a Nigerian prince scam, but more along the lines of like a car dealership. I mean, sure, with a car dealership, you can get a legitimate deal from them, but the vast majority of them, if you don't know any better and you let them, they will take advantage of you. They're going to rip you off. And that's kind of how I feel about the solar install companies. I mean, I've had a number of them come knocking on my door over the last 10 years or so, and I've listened to their sales pitch and ran the numbers, and I'm just like, no, I mean, it's a ripoff.
And the great thing about having even some DIY panels on your roof is that no solar salesman will show up at your door. Being a YouTuber is stressful, and in my case, it means working a lot of long hours in solitude, but it does have its perks, and one of those is that companies like EcoFlow send me cool stuff for free. And they've sent me something I'm pretty excited about. This is the Delta Pro 3. This is going to replace the 2 units I installed 2 years ago. So before I tell you what is so great about this unit, let me tell you the problems I have with the old setup. The biggest problem by far is I needed 240 volts to run the building's air conditioning, and the only way to get that is by using 2 of these units together with the special hub. The problem with that is they're on 2 different sets of solar panels, so they charge at different rates. And they also discharge at different rates. And so just after a day or 2, the units can become out of balance. Now, as you can see here, the left unit is at 100% capacity, so it can no longer accept any solar power, while the right unit is at 92%. Now, this is out of balance at the top end. And then you can see during my last big test, the left unit ran totally out of power, while the right unit still had 19%. So the great thing about this new unit, as you can see, is it has a 240 volt output right on the single unit. And even better, it has dual solar inputs. So the idea is I can use a single unit to replace both of my previous units like so. Unfortunately, I didn't read the specs too closely until I started setting everything up, and I realized a problem. The 2 solar inputs on the back aren't the same. The one on the left can go up to 150 volts, 15 amps, and a total of 1600 watts. Pretty much just like the old unit, so no problem. The one on the right, however, only goes up to 60 volts, 20 amps, and a total of 1000 watts. So this does present a problem. The way my panels were set up before, the 3 large panels can stay exactly like they are, but the 10 smaller panels I have aren't going to work. And that's because the way they're currently set up is in 2 strings of 5, which gives us 2 sets of 120 volts working in parallel. What I'm going to need to do is break them up like this. That way they're working in sections of 48 volts each, and they can go all in parallel. Now, this does actually work to a slight advantage. With my fence-mounted panels, the one on the right is unfortunately in the shade most of the day. And because they're in series, when this one panel isn't working, it basically means none of these are working. So by moving them to this configuration, the shade won't even matter. In fact, I'll remove that panel from the fence completely. But even when the evening comes and starts to shade the ones on the left, it won't completely cut my power because the center panels will keep working longer. In fact, that's the hope, is that I'll be making less peak power with this setup, but I should be able to make power much longer than usual, so hopefully it makes up the difference. Also, for my pergola panels, these 3 big ones will not change, but I'll be wiring these 2 together, these 2 together. This one will no longer connect to anything. So my friend Sean came over to help me remove the old units, and it's definitely a 2-person job to get them down. Then I masked out where I wanted to extend the shelf to, since the new units are slightly larger and won't fit on the old shelf. And then I constructed a new shelf, which should be good for several hundred pounds of weight. I also used floor tiles on top of the shelves for the surface. And then we put the new units up there. Plugged in the 2 extra batteries, and was even able to use one of the existing remote screens I already had. I also had to rewire the panels, so I used these 3-way splitters so I could run the different sections in parallel. Unfortunately, this one panel is left unused at the moment, but I don't want to take it down because I want the shade. Next, I finished painting the shelf, and yeah, I think it looks pretty good. And there's one other really nice advantage to this unit over the old ones: noise. Have a listen to the fans on the old ones here. And now the new one. Oh, and I thought of an idea for the one remaining panel. I went ahead and ran a couple of new wires up the same hole that was already there, and then I brought them down into the building over where I keep my smaller EcoFlow Delta 2, which I typically use to power my booths at conventions and stuff like that. This way the single panel can keep it topped up for whenever I need it.
Okay, so I'm not going to do a full-blown power outage test this time. Unfortunately, August is just looking to be impossible to coordinate such a thing with my family. So what I am going to do is I'm first going to run over some boring power generation numbers just so you can see how much power I need and how much I make. And then I'm going to do a test with just the studio building to see exactly how long we can run it this time around with the new equipment installed. And then after that, I got a number of little smaller tests that I want to do that are related to emergency preparedness that I think will be relevant. And then I want to address a few of the questions that I got asked in some of the previous videos.
So let's run over those numbers to help clear up some things. First of all, during the summer, I use about 100 kilowatt hours on a typical day, which is a nice round number, and it makes it a lot of the following math pretty easy to break down. 60% of this goes to my house, another 10% goes to my studio building, and the remaining 30% or so goes to our 3 electric vehicles in the house. It used to be less than that during and after COVID, but it seems we're all driving a lot more than we were a few years ago. But I could break this down even further and say that about 10% of this power goes to appliances I consider non-essential, like the oven, dishwasher, water heater, and even the washing machine and dryer. Another 10% goes to what I consider essential appliances, like all of the lights in the house, the refrigerator, computers, network, phones, etc. And the remaining portion is the air conditioner. So this is how much power I need. Now let's talk about how much I can make. The 9 panels on my house typically produce about 2,400 watts on a sunny day, although I have seen as high as 4,249 watts when conditions were just right. And on a typical day, I produce around 19 kilowatt hours. And here's the curve on how that typically looks. As you can see, it's a nice curve, meaning that the panels are high enough that they don't typically get shaded at all. Now, the studio panels produce about half of that, typically coming in around 1,200 watts, and they only produce around 6 kilowatt hours in a day. And as you can see, this curve isn't as smooth as the one for the house, and that's because I have trees blocking the panels until nearly noon each day. So this gray area I've painted in represents what I could be making if not for the shade. So on a good day, between the two systems, I produce around 25 kilowatt hours of power, which is about a quarter of my daily usage. Now, believe it or not, even on a cloudy day, I still make around 15 kilowatt hours of power. And even on a really dark, stormy day, I can make around 5 kilowatt hours, which is sort of surprising even to me. Now, let's have a look at how much power I really need during an emergency. As long as I'm not planning to go anywhere, I won't be charging the cars. And I won't be using these non-essential appliances or the central air conditioner. But I will be running at least 2 window units, so that's about 40 kilowatt hours of power. But one interesting thing to keep in mind is that I have, at this point, between the two systems, 24 kilowatt hours of battery storage. Actually 25 if you count the smaller unit I mentioned earlier. I've just about doubled my capacity since last year. And if I can produce another 25 during the day, then that's 50 kilowatt hours I have to work with. So as you can see, I've upgraded quite a bit from my original plan, which was just 4 panels on the roof and a small Bluetti, with the intention of keeping one room habitable. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that philosophy if you're on a budget. So today is the big test. It's just past 6 o'clock in the morning. It's still dark outside, and the weather is not nearly as bad as it could be. In fact, the forecast is only a high of 99 degrees today. Normally in August it would be at least 5 degrees hotter than this, but it'll have to do because I need to get this done this week. So here we are. I'm actually at 99% battery this morning, which is where I'm going to start this test. I don't have a smart panel in my studio, so I still have to do the switch over manually, which I usually do every morning anyway, so nothing new here. There we go. We're running on battery power for the moment. And here's another little test I wanted to do. I have this little EcoFlow camping light that they gave me at one of their events, and I thought I'd see, how long it really lasts. It's also a battery bank and can charge your phone or whatever, and I'm just going to set it on high and see how long it goes over the course of today. So, skipping forward about an hour later, I wanted to show you these 2 additional panels that I've connected with an extension cord. Now, they're working in parallel with the fence panels. I had done some testing last week where I hooked up just these 2 panels to my smaller EcoFlow unit just to see how much power they could make. As you can see here, I was generating a little over 160 watts. So my thought is with these is that because they're movable, I can essentially chase the sunlight all day by moving them around, keeping them in the optical angle, etc. I mean, if I can average 150 watts over a period of 10 hours, that works out to an extra 1.5 kilowatt hours, which works out to about 2 hours worth of running the air conditioner, so that's not an insignificant amount. And sure, I wouldn't want to mess with this on a regular day, but in an emergency power situation, this is certainly a viable option, and so I wanted to see how it works out. Let's skip forward a couple more hours to 9:45. As you can see, this wasn't a great place to put the panels, so I eventually moved them back. And finally, I was getting some sunlight. In fact, these two panels were the only panels generating sunlight, and you can see here my production was at 167 watts. Not much, but I'll take it. So now let's skip forward a few hours to 12:20 in the afternoon, and this is about the point in the day where I usually reach parity with what I'm using and what I'm making. It only improves from here. So skipping forward another hour, you can see I'm now making 1.4 kilowatts. Now, this is the highest number I've ever seen with this setup, so the extra two panels are definitely helping. And the temperature has only reached 95 so far. I've had to relocate these bonus panels several times in order to attempt to keep them in the sun. I think this will be the last place I can move them.
Okay, so switching gears for a moment, I want to talk about some of these emergency preparedness supplies that I've got. So obviously I still have my stove, which I used in the wintertime test. I was very happy with this, but the one thing I didn't have was some pots and pans and stuff because my wife wouldn't let me use hers. So I got these, and we're going to be testing these out later. But let's talk about the emergency candles for a moment. So I did show these off too in the wintertime test. And I was a little disappointed in them to some extent because they didn't last 36 hours or even the 12 hours that they're supposed to last when you're using all 3 wicks. You really only got about 8 hours of it. But honestly, that's not too bad. In fact, as cheap as these are and the fact they last forever, they're probably a good idea to keep some of these around. Now, admittedly, they don't make as much heat as I'd like. I think based on my testing, they only produce probably around the equivalent of like 200 watts of electric heat if you were using a resistive heater. So you'd need like a whole bunch, like all 6 of these, for example, to produce enough heat to even compare to like a space heater or something. So let's talk about these guys for a moment. So back during the wintertime power outage test, I found that these guys are kind of what saved the day because I had some trouble with the kerosene heater. And these things are cheap and they're more or less idiot proof. And while they're designed for cooking, I found that they were as capable as a decent sized space heater in the house. Now, they say they last for 4 hours, but I actually found that these last more like 5. And I found that 3 of these would more or less keep my house at a livably warm temperature. And I even found that just one of these cans running in this studio building here was enough to more or less keep the entire building warm, or at least livably warm. And and I say they're more or less idiot proof. The one problem I found is that while they do produce a lot of heat on the top, they also produce a lot of heat on the bottom. And I had left one of these sitting on my bench like that, and it actually ended up after a few hours melting a circular hole in the tile, and so I had to peel that tile up and replace it. That's actually one of the reasons I love having tiles like these on my workbench. But I would say that if you are going to use these, be sure you have something like a stone or pot holder type thing or something to to put these on, because they will definitely melt or catch on fire whatever they are sitting on. So I actually bought some more of these after the wintertime power test, but then I was at Sam's one day and I noticed that they had these, and these are actually 6-hour versions, and when you buy them in bulk, they're like $1.50 each. And the irony is I did some math on these as how long they last and how much I paid for them. And it's funny because it's almost cost competitive with heating my house with electricity using resistive heat. I also bought this thing. It's not really meant for this, but you can actually sit it on top of one of these cans of heat. It's actually meant for like a butane stove or something like that. But I found that it worked pretty well for dispersing the heat out and making sure that there's no open flame around.
Switching gears for a moment, let's talk about food. I always keep a certain amount of shelf-stable food around, and here's the few things I like to keep. For meals, I usually go for these Hormel Completes. I consider them a poor man's MRE. They have a lot of choices, and I've tried them all, but these here are my favorite. Now, let's be clear, I don't consider these to be particularly healthy, nor are they even that tasty. I sort of rank them like this. So if a home-cooked meal is number 1, then a frozen dinner from the supermarket would be number 2. Hormel Completes would be like number 3 below that. However, they are still better than all of the dehydrated survival foods or camping foods that I've tried, which I'd put at number 4. Now, I typically eat about 1 of these a month, and I try to cycle in new ones, so I always have a relatively fresh supply. I also like to keep on hand things like nuts or trail mix. I prefer smaller bags, that way I can consume them throughout the year without having to open a large container. I also keep dried fruit on hand, but I'm out of that right now. Oh, and I always keep a supply of bottled water as well. So one thing I wanted to put to the test is the question of, can you cook with one of these candles? I mean, there's no question you can cook with one of these, as I did that in the last test, and I managed to cook some scrambled eggs. But there's some debate on the internet as to whether one of these candles could cook anything, so let's find out. The first thing I wanted to try was warming up one of these Hormel mills. I mean, it's a pretty low bar because it doesn't really require to be cooked, it just needs to be warmed. Now, to be honest, as hot as it is, I could probably just sit this on the sidewalk for an hour and it'd be plenty warm. But that's not what I'm out to find out. If it were wintertime, I'd cook this inside and I'd dump the contents out into the pan and warm it that way. But since it's summer and there's bugs everywhere, I'm going to follow Hormel's instructions for campsite heating, which is to place it in a pan of water and then heat the water. So there we go. I'm going to set a timer and see how long it takes to get this up to a desirable temperature. After 15 minutes, the top of it rose to 83 degrees. After 30 minutes, we got 89 degrees. After an hour, we got 106 degrees. And after 2 full hours, it was reading 118 degrees on the top. But interestingly enough, the water in the pan was reading 145 degrees, and the bottom of the tray was also reading 145 degrees. So, time to open it up. It's not steaming like it would be coming out of the microwave, but it's definitely warm. So, I started to eat it. And it was actually just about the perfect temperature. I mean, sure, it took 2 hours to get there, but I guess it worked. So I think it's safe to say that you can use the candle to warm any sort of shelf-stable foods like soup, chili, Spam, etc. But I don't think it can get hot enough to actually cook anything. Back to my solar status. Over the next few hours, my batteries actually managed to charge up some, making it all the way back up to 90% before the power started to drop off. At 5:30 in the evening, the power input dropped to where it was just enough to run the place but not charge the batteries. It's still 98 degrees outside. It did briefly peak around 100 degrees earlier.
Oh, another interesting thing is this also just now died, which means it ran for 11 hours, but remember I was running it on high, so I imagine on low it would have probably run considerably longer, but that's 11 hours is not nothing to laugh at.
Okay, so it's 6 o'clock and it has now been 12 hours without power, and as you can see, my bonus panels are in the shade now. Unfortunately, there's just nowhere I can really move them to. I mean, there's still sun out in the front yard, but my extension cables won't reach that far. So, skipping forward to 8:30 in the evening, solar production for today is basically over. So let's go inside and find out what the status of things is. Now, the interesting thing is, this is usually the point in the day where I switch back to grid power, so everything up to this point has been pretty normal for me. Now, we're down to 74% on the batteries, and it's saying we have 10 hours left, but I suspect it will be more than that because as the night goes on, it will cool down and the air conditioner won't be working quite so hard, but it is still 92 degrees outside. Now, the interesting thing is I did make 7.86 kilowatt hours today, which is a new record for me. The previous record was 7.5, so I'm sure those extra panels helped. They produced exactly the amount of power I thought they would, but the disappointing part was I wasn't able to keep them in the sun as long as I thought I could. So I think they really only ended up making a little less than a kilowatt hour, but I'll take it. Okay, back the next morning around 7:30. It is 79 degrees outside. And time to find out if we still have power. Spoiler, I already know we do because I checked the app on my phone. And here we are, down to 18%. And it says we have 3 hours left. Unfortunately, that may not be enough to make it until noon when the good solar production starts. So I've been planning to perform another little test. Since I have this small EcoFlow unit here, I wondered if I could use it to charge the big one. I know I'll lose some in the transfer, but at this point any little amount would help. So I'll plug the power cable into the AC input of the big unit and then to the AC output on the small unit. I have configured the large unit to only pull a maximum of 400 watts from its AC power input, which should be easy for the smaller unit to handle. And I did test this the other day when plugging it into the wall. So let's see what happens. I'm currently making 35 watts just from the ambient light outside of the panels. So let's turn this on. And well, then this happened. I was pulling over 1,000 watts, which wasn't supposed to happen. And you can see that reflected here as well. The units were making some weird noises too, so I decided to stop this. I'm really not sure why that didn't work like I wanted, but then I thought, hey, why not try this instead? These units can also charge from a car's cigarette lighter, and the small EcoFlow unit has such an output on it. Unfortunately, it does require that I unplug one of the solar panel arrays to make this work. And it does work. It's pulling almost 100 watts. which is not a huge amount, but the units seem happy with it. It's weird that the smaller unit thinks it's only 89 watts going out. I have no explanation for that. The other thing I'm going to try to do is conserve some power for the next few hours, so I'm going to shut off the air conditioner. The temperature outside isn't too bad for the moment, and I'm going to shut off the lights. At this point, I'm still using around 115 watts just to run the computers and network gear in the building, which is unfortunately slightly more than I have going in, but this should still buy some time. Okay, skipping forward an hour and a half, and my little bonus panels are finally able to get some sunlight, so I'm probably better off using the DC input port for solar at this point, as it will probably be more than 100 watts. I think this concept would have worked better had I started the transfer last night when there was no solar to be made. Fast forward to noon. The only panels getting any sunlight are these two bonus panels and the ones on my fence, which is a few hundred watts. Looking at the thermometer, with the air conditioning off for almost 4 hours, the temperature has risen by 4 degrees as it was 72 before. But before it starts to get uncomfortable, I'm going to turn the air conditioner back on. And that puts us up to using more power than we're making, but I suspect that will change shortly. Skipping forward a few hours.
Over here, we are currently making quite a bit more than we're actually using. We're actually recharged all the way back up to 22% and going. And my little EcoFlow over here is slowly recharging at a measly 70 watts from its single panel, but it is recharging.
Skipping forward to 4:30 on the second day here, you can see the weather has reached 100 degrees, and we've unfortunately hit that stage of the day where production is just barely matching what we're using. So the battery will not make it above 22% today. And here we are again at 7 o'clock, and the solar is basically done for the day. Well, I say that. Actually, I'm still making 100 watts from the ambient light, but that won't last long. You can see the battery is down to 15%, and it says it will run for another 2 hours. Total production for the second day was 7.92 kilowatt hours, which is a new record still. Now we'll skip forward to 9:38 in the evening, and we're down to 1%, and it claims we have 9 minutes of power left. That turned out to be pretty close.
Power just went out, and by my calculations, I think we went 41 hours without grid power. So that's quite respectable. Can't complain about that. Let's switch back to grid. There we go.
And there we go. That's it. I'm actually quite satisfied with this result, and that's why I don't plan on doing any further updates at this point, and probably why there won't be any more videos on the topic. So yeah, I think pretty much whatever comes my way, I think I'm pretty much prepared for it now. That being said, I want to tackle a couple of questions that came up in a previous video.
In the last video, I showed using a small 500 watt space heater to attempt to keep one room warm during the winter, and I got literally hundreds of comments telling me about the marvels of the heat pump and questioning why I don't use those instead. And I think there are primarily two misunderstandings about this, and so I'll address both of them. First of all, I do have heat pumps already. The main unit for my house is a heat pump, as are the mini splits in my studio building. So then you might ask, well, why not just use those? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, let me show you the user manual of my primary HVAC unit as an example. As you can see here, this is definitely a heat pump according to the model number. Now, this graph here represents how the heat pump works in different ambient temperatures. And as you can see, anything much below 30 degrees is going to require the auxiliary heat. And the auxiliary heat is just a resistive heater. And being that I performed this test when it was 15 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the reality is I would have been using resistive heat one way or the other.
Now, I have been made aware that some of the heat pumps sold in colder climates do in fact work down to even lower temperatures, but the ones sold here in Texas generally do not, and I suspect the reason is probably because they're tuned better to our climate, which is primarily hot. I mean, we only have a few days a year that the temperature drops below the freezing point, so it's just really not an issue.
But, the bottom line is I wanted to see two things with that test. I wanted to see how long the power would last if rationed specifically to 500 watts, which was easy to do with a space heater. And I also wanted to see if 500 watts was enough to keep a single room warm, and it was. The next set of comments I wanted to address have to do with power reliability. Now, when I mentioned that in the last 20 years we had experienced 5 power outages, 4 in the summer and 1 in the winter.
So the comments were quite hilarious to me because on one hand, I had people from countries like Sweden saying that the Texas power grid must be awful because they hadn't experienced a power outage in like 50 years or some crazy such thing. And then on the flip side of that, I had people from countries like South Africa and India saying, we get 5 power outages every single day. So I think a little objectivity would go a long way here. And the other thing is, I mean, I feel like people in Sweden, for example, I don't think that they have to deal with the extreme heat that we have, the thunderstorms, the tornadoes, or the hurricanes that we get, down around the Gulf of Mexico. So I just don't think it's a really fair comparison. Objectively, I think our power grid's actually fairly reliable. I mean, back in the early 2000s, I had a Linux machine that was not even connected to any sort of battery backup or anything like that, and it had an uptime on it of like 3 or 4 years at one point, which means the power had never even so much as flickered in that period of time. Anyway, on to another little test.
Since I have this Delta 2 always topped up anyway, I thought, hey, let's do one more little experiment. Can this thing run a window unit air conditioner? A lot of people say it's impossible to run one from a small unit like this, but as long as it's an inverter driven like mine, it won't have that strong inrush current at startup, and sure enough, it runs just fine. So I did 2 tests. The first test is I ran the unit on full blast, which was chewing up over 600 watts, and I let it run until it died. And then I charged it up and ran it again, this time running the unit in low mode, which was eating over 300 watts. And so, what are the results? Well, on full blast, which is a full 12,000 BTU, it lasted an hour and 15 minutes. And on low mode, which is still a very respectable 6,000 BTU and could easily keep a single isolated room cool, it lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. So is that useful? Well, for a long-term outage, probably not. But if you're just trying to get through a rolling blackout or something, I could see it being handy. And by the way, these smaller units also have solar input, and I'm sure with the addition of some panels, it could keep an AC running quite a bit longer.
Okay, just a few final thoughts. So I've done several of these tests now. None of them went exactly like I had planned originally, but I learned new things each time I did it and made improvements for the next time. So my advice for anyone out there who's trying to improve your emergency preparedness is whatever strategy that you're planning on using, whether it's a gas generator and a propane grill or a solar setup or whatever, I recommend that you put it to the test. That means setting aside either the hottest day of the year or the coldest day of the year, turning the power off and just pretending it's an emergency and just see how it all works. I guarantee it will not go exactly like you've planned. So that's about all I have to say for that. The other thing I wanted to mention is for those of you who have been missing the restorations, if you didn't know, I have been doing restorations of arcade machines over on the Time Rift Arcade channel. So if you haven't seen those yet, I'll put a link down in the description. Be sure to jump over there and look at that. The other thing is I'm going to be at VCF Midwest. That's in the Chicago area. In just a few weeks, and I have a big presentation planned on that Sunday, so I hope everybody comes to see it. So that is all. As always, thanks for watching.